All right, everyone, at least one senator from Hawaii was like, yeah, I stand with Sarah Jeong, get over it. And it's like, yeah, I stand with people who spout off racism all day. And I was thinking to myself, this is just a part of the modern so-called left's political strategy. It's really just political strategy for them. If you're running for office and 80% of your constituents think that what she's saying is perfectly acceptable, it's like, who are your constituents? Your constituents are, by and large, they're going to be younger voters, sort of the college kid crowd, people who are further left, people who have been indoctrinated, certain minority groups, and so forth. They probably don't really care if you say this sort of thing. Like Hawaii. Think of the demographics of Hawaii, especially in a political sense. Hawaii is overwhelmingly liberal. If you therefore don't take up an overwhelmingly liberal line, and this is a problem for the Democrats, I'll explain that in a moment, then you probably don't win election. The problem is that partisan politics are beginning to tip towards fringes, both on the right and on the left. It's like with Trump. One of his operative strategies was just to say things that were much more far out there than any other candidate in the field. Anyone, therefore, that felt like the establishment didn't really represent them leaned towards supporting Trump heavily. Therefore, even though he never had a majority of that coalition, in a crowded race, it didn't matter. What do we know about off-year elections is there are a lot of crowded races. What's happening within the left is the same basic phenomena. What's happening is that candidates that are further left, in blue states and in blue enclaves, where people are, far left, they're outperforming centrists within the Democratic Party. The problem for the Democratic Party, therefore, is that it's almost not functioning like a national party. The problem is that these two groups will inevitably attack one another and obstruct one another even more than they would attack and obstruct Republicans. See, maybe 8 years ago, when the vast majority of people in Congress or in state houses, they're either neoliberals and Democrat or neocons and Republican. They are very, very close to one another. To the point where for years there I pointed this out. They had to manufacture wedge issues just to differentiate their platforms. Because fundamentally, is there a big difference between, hey, I want to tax this good at 40% and hey, I want to tax it at 42%? There's no big difference. Is there a big difference between, hey, I want a little more gun control and hey, I don't want any more gun control? No, they're not weird, out there views. I would say they're both unconstitutional, by the way, as a libertarian. But for the lamestream, they're not that different. Saying, well, I want one additional piece of legislation, or hey, I want one less piece of legislation. Out of millions of pieces of legislation, there is no difference really between the platforms. But then somebody comes along on the right and says, well, I disagree with your 40 and 42% tax. I want to lower it to 20%. Wow, that's out there. People who aren't really receptive to taxes, they're all going to flock to that candidate if they care about economic issues. Trump did this. On the left, you see the same thing now. You see people embracing bigotry in order to differentiate themselves from the center left. In order to differentiate themselves from the neoliberals have a problem, which is that the Republicans have totally washed them away with the working class. The working and middle class has largely defected to Trump because the economy is going well. They can't compete with that. They have to find some other way to build a coalition. The far left has the answer. We'll just wine and dine people who would be green voters or who would be generally apolitical. They're not excited about the Democrats because we represent old neoliberalism. Let's be progressives now. That'll get them going. The problem being, of course, that coalition is totally unstable because the moneyed interests within the party, the neoliberals, they've always campaigned on wedge issues. Hillary Clinton did this. She's like, well, women's rights this, women's rights that. If she had been elected, she would have immediately shut up about it, given them breadcrumbs, and then done nothing further. The same is true for gay rights. What did the Democratic Party do with gay rights? They dragged their heels for 30 fucking years while other people, other activists that had nothing to do with them, and the fringe far left talked about it along with the libertarians. Then they took it up as a banner and pretended that they had been pushing the issue the entire time, but they always paid lip service to it. Oh yeah, I think it's wonderful when people are in love. Maybe we need to be kind to people, but they never pushed the issue because it was unpopular. The progressives, they're willing to push the issue whether or not it's popular. Now, this is really good if you're in a far left part of the country. If you're running for office in Central California or the New York City suburbs, or you're running for office, you're going to be the representative from Austin or something. Yeah, it makes sense to have a far left platform, of course, because otherwise someone else will come along who is on the far left and they will beat you. So you want to be that progressive candidate. How are they going to play nice with the neoliberals? Some of these people are ideologues. They're not actually pragmatic liberals. They're ideologues who think, well, this is right, that is right. If you don't agree, I think you're evil and racist and despicable. I'm not going to work with the neoliberals or the neocons. Certainly not the Trumpites. The only thing at this point that seems to be even holding the glue that's holding the Democratic Party even loosely together is shared disdain for Donald Trump. Oh, what's going to happen when he's no longer the president? Or, conversely, what happens as his approval slowly rises? Which it is. It's beginning to rise again. It had been stagnant for a while at around 43, 44%. It's rising up towards the magic number. Where's the Democratic coalition? When you've got a quarter of the party or a fifth of the party, somewhere around there, I would suspect, that is blatantly far, far left, like a Cortez, someone who is a democratic socialist or social democrat, which is to say socialist, or someone who's like, I'm a progressive, I'm like to the left of Bernie Sanders. How are they supposed to play nice with someone like Nancy Pelosi? What'll end up happening is they'll have to form a synthesis platform, which is exactly why Gillibrand right now is attempting to cast herself as the missing link, the glue of the party. That's her operative strategy. It's a brilliant strategy, and it could work. She will be in the head of the pack if she runs. She has name recognition, she has corporate money, and she plays nice with the further left. Whether or not that platform can remain stable, of course, remains, though, to be seen. It may not even work. We've got to see. They could crash and burn completely as a party. But here's the thing. The left has to try to normalize racism and sexism. They just make a differentiation. It's like I pointed out. They don't mind bigotry as long as it's the right kind of bigotry. So if you're making jokes about white people or males or straights or Christians or something, they don't have a problem with that. The problem is this is going to inevitably bite them in the ass because the neoliberals will tacitly support that, but they don't like to discuss it too much. The progressives, the further left, they love it. They love to browbeat people based on their race and their gender and stuff. They absolutely adore it. It's like a single issue platform for them. That is that the Democratic Party that has used wedge issues to build 51% of the voters-style coalitions throughout time is being endangered by people who might actually deliver on those promises. They're not going to be able to work with the neoliberals. They're being elected by people who expect them to actually outlaw maleness or reparations or something. The neoliberals are never going to do that. They're a they represent the Democrats as a national party. Most parts of the country reject that message. So what works in San Francisco or New York City is never going to work in some swing state area that the Democrats want to hold on to. That's why McCaskill must be so nervous right now. All of these Democrats, the fundamental problem is that so many of them are vulnerable because they're within red regions. They are moderate Democrats. It's the moderates that are getting swept away. This is the same thing, by the way, we see in Europe. Who's suffering in election after election? Who is losing support? The establishment, the centrist parties. So-called centrism, of course. They're all just authoritarians generally to me. People who are center-left, center-right. Hey, we've been in power for 20 years. Because when there are problems, groups that harangue from the fringe always prevail over centrists. Therefore, you have multiple fringes form. They usually what happens is you go back to a standard order as they synthesize. They get pulled back into the so-called center. They might nudge it in one direction or another on an issue or two. And so you return to stability. What's happening now is that because the globalists are so inept and so corrupt, they're not actually attempting to fix those problems and in some cases physically can't. So the fringe keeps growing and growing. Now here in the United States, we're very lucky. The fringe that grew on the right here and took dominance is just a populist movement. It's not out there, it's not actually racist, it's not actually sexist, it's not actually fiscally fucking floating around the moon. It's not an odd movement, it is historically a fairly normal place to be. It's just replacing the neocons. What happens on the left? We don't know. It could be the far left, it could be the business Democrats rise back up, it could be a blue dog movement. By the way, that would be the best thing for this country. But we have to wait and see, and the Democrats have to deal with the fact that the style of wedge issue politics that they've been using, especially from the 80s through the 2000s, it no longer works well. The Republicans have outmaneuvered them. You've got two platforms building. One platform is us versus them, and the other platform is us versus them. What's the difference? What's the GOP's platform? Us, America, versus them, the rest of the world. Well, if you're trying to win the votes of Americans, that's a pretty expansive platform. What are the Democrats doing? Us, the really poor / minorities versus all whites, maleness, toxic masculinity, people who don't mind pronouns, people who are not PC enough, content creators, the alt media, Trump, certain Democrats that are too moderate. You've boxed yourself, you've painted yourself into a corner. What you've done is you've limited the coalition you're capable of building. You've got a low ceiling. In the most strict sense, outside of blue zones, the Democrats have a low ceiling. I don't think they can compete in the Rust Belt with that kind of platform in 2020. But they need to use racism and sexism as wedge issues in order to prevail. But, you can't use wedge issues without a wedge, fundamentally. Well, then you need people to be divided. You need a divisive political atmosphere in which people feel that they're not part of any greater total. That's what the Democrats need in order to prevail with that kind of message. So what are they going to do going forward? They're going to stir up trouble. And when people realize Trump, you can say that he's not, that he's the divisive one, that's projection. He's the great uniter. He's like, hey, I want everyone to be richer. It's the United States, America first. That's not a divisive platform. You can call it one, but it's not. Historically speaking, that is the norm that our country has existed at for the last century. The abnormality is really in the post-Reagan HW era with neoliberalism. Corporate neoliberals abandoning actual leftism and a right wing that goes along with them and sort of muddies itself and rolls around in the mud. Trump has abandoned that for all intents and purposes. That's about all. Peace out.